Pac-Man needs no further introduction. If you know anything about video games, you know all about our yellow circular friend who eats dots, runs away from ghosts, and eventually falls in love. Right, falls in love. The story of Miss Pac-Man is not the story of developers trying to milk a successful franchise for all it was worth. At least, not right away. Rather, it's the story of a different video game developer, Atari, trying to avoid an expensive legal battle. In so doing, they help their competitor, Midway, further dominate the arcade market. Miss Pac-Man is the story of two young programmers who came up with a brilliant idea and turned it into a goldmine. And, in a rarity within the video game business, it's a story where everyone wins. This is the story of Pac-Man, Miss Pac-Man. Miss Pac-Man came out in 1982, but our story begins in 1980, and specifically with two MIT students, Doug McRae and Kevin Curran. In addition to his studies, McRae managed a small coin-op route that allowed him to make some supplemental cash. This route consisted of 20 pinball machines, including ones in MIT dorms, and a handful of arcade games, including Missile Command. Missile Command was a wildly popular 1980 arcade game in which you protect your cities from launched missiles. Like all successful arcade games, Missile Command had a relatively short shelf life. And while McRae's route was popular at first, eventually the money began to slow down. This decline in profits, from $650 in week 1 to $200 in week 3, happened for two reasons. First, players got good. Second, the game got stale. McRae realized that this was a common problem, particularly for small-time operators like himself. Arcade games were expensive, and when they got old, they lost popularity, and he had to buy a new game. That meant he had to constantly invest his profits in new material. Or did he? During his senior year, McRae partnered with Doug Curran, as well as three other MIT students, Steve Golson, John Tlyko, and Larry Dennison, to update Missile Command, rather than buy a new game. The team disassembled the Missile Command code and created a new circuit board that would literally fit on top of the game's existing hardware. This wasn't easy. In later interviews, the team noted that one monitor could break down the code, but they couldn't print it. As a result, one person had to read the code, and another had to retype it on a different machine. By structuring their business this way, the men hoped to avoid potential copyright violations, as they weren't changing existing code, just adding to it. As a result, McRae, Curran, and the rest of the team created a new game, Super Missile Attack. The game altered speeds, created more enemies, and updated colors. Unsurprisingly, it was a hit. Players loved the concept of Missile Command, but the game had grown old. Armed with new features and colors, McRae and Curran were able to bring players back to the game. Of course, by now, McRae and Curran realized that they had something better than just a one-time operation that could be used to enhance one game on their coin-op route, and the two decided to stay in this business and continue operations. They incorporated as General Computer Corporation and began to work on turning their idea from a side gig into a fully fledged business. At first, they were off to a fantastic start. Their enhancement kits cost $20 to make, and they were able to sell them at $300 a pop. In the summer of 1981, they sold over 1,000 boards and obviously made a small fortune in the process. The two then set their sights on the most popular game in the world at the time, Pac-Man. Their goal was to create a significantly new game called Crazy Otto, Pac-Man with legs. Creepy. In August 1981, they were deep into disassembling that code. However, Atari, developer and publisher of Missile Command, did not take kindly to the enhancement kits, and they filed a $15 million lawsuit, $5 million against McRae and Curran each, plus another $5 million against the company. And honestly, I don't really blame them. Curran and McRae were using Atari's intellectual property without permission to turn a profit themselves. The case was somewhat revolutionary and covered new legal ground, but you can absolutely see Atari's arguments here. More to the point, this was a fundamental shot at Atari's business model. Atari thrived because games got old and arcade operators needed to buy new games. If they could just enhance already existing games and do so from businesses not connected to Atari, Atari stood to lose a decent amount of money. McRae and Curran argued that they were not infringing on Atari's copyright, as they hadn't directly copied any code, they were just adding to it. Remember, they created a new board that modified the system, telling it to run the enhancement code instead. In an interview, McRae likened it to adding comments into the margins of a book. However, Atari won a temporary restraining order, halting all sales of Super Missile Attack. Now, that actually didn't work for Atari. Atari had specific intellectual property concerns, and a judge allowed General Computer to create a new version that they could potentially sell. Atari now had a major profit-losing problem, and decided it was time to end the lawsuit. Skip Paul, legal counsel for Atari, approached General Computers with an offer. This conversation turned into a lucrative settlement for everyone. Atari would drop the lawsuit with prejudice, meaning that they would essentially admit that it was a wrongfully filed lawsuit. They would then pay Curran and McRae $50,000 per month for the next 2 years. In exchange, the two would stop making the enhancement kits. So, in theory, this would be the end of the business, right? McRae and Curran had struck gold. Well, not exactly. Remember, the two were already working on a Pac-Man modification. Pac-Man was the property of Namco and Midway, not Atari. They didn't want to stop the development of this enhancement kit, so they had an exception carved into the settlement. No more enhancement kits without the explicit permission from the game manufacturer. With this settlement in mind, Curran and McRae flew to Chicago in the hopes of convincing Midway into accepting a deal to produce Crazy Otto. Their plan was to use their legal win to essentially bluff Midway into giving their blessing. However, Midway had a better idea. Pac-Man was popular, yes, but it was already past its peak. Actually, Midway was looking at layoffs. Instead of creating an enhancement kit, the company had a bigger and better idea. Let's take what you've got and turn it into a sequel. This was not what McRae and Curran had in mind. It was much better. It also fit into what Midway needed. Midway, deeply and understandably protective of their intellectual property, had some changes. Most importantly, Pac-Man with legs was unacceptable, as the sequel had to be faithful to the original intellectual property. As such, no legs. Honestly, that's a good thing. This thing is creepy as hell. However, a female Pac-Man was in. Thus, Miss Pac-Man was born and given a variety of cosmetic changes, including lipstick, a beauty mark, hair, and a bow. When sent to Masaya Nakamura, president of Namco at the time, Nakamura gave his blessing. However, he instructed the developers to get rid of Miss Pac-Man's hair. A series of genuinely comedic challenges followed, including the name of the game, which was Super Pac-Man and Pac-Woman at one point, and what title to use. A brief cutscene in the original game showed Pac-Man falling in love and having a baby with a female Pac-Man, now presumed to be our female Pac-Hero. As such, Miss Pac-Man was out, as that would have implied the birth of a Pac-Baby out of wedlock. Mrs. Pac-Man was used before changing the name to Ms. Pac-Man to make Ms. Pac-Man sound like a strong, independent Pac thing. It's also worth noting that the game was created as an explicit acknowledgement that more women were playing. Stan Jarocki, director of marketing for Midway, said as much, noting that Pac-Man itself was the first major commercial game with a large percentage of female players. This perfectly lines up with Toru Iwatana's intent when creating Pac-Man. He wanted the game to appeal to more women. The appeal worked. In fact, multiple estimates at the time, although purely anecdotal, noted that a majority of Miss Pac-Man players may have been women. Now, just to be clear, Ms. Pac-Man came with a lot more than just cosmetic changes. In fact, the game made a series of pretty significant improvements on the original. Different maze patterns and colors were used, including the deployment of more than just one warp tunnel. Ghosts' behaviors were different and improved, making it harder for expert players to beat the game. Bonus items moved around the maze. Miss Pac-Man had an improved death animation that looks like she swoons when she's killed. Cutscenes show the development of the relationship between Mr. and Miss Pac-Man, which also includes the birth of the Pac-Baby, another future game. Miss Pac-Man would be released in arcades starting in February 1982 and would eventually be ported to dozens of other systems. It was a massive hit. By 1988, the game sold more than 125,000 units, making it the fourth best-selling worldwide arcade game of all time, behind only Space Invaders, the original Pac-Man, and Donkey Kong. The game grossed $1.5 billion in revenue by 1995, and that's separate from its merchandising success or the sales of the game on other ports. Miss Pac-Man was not the end of General Computer's involvement with the Pac-Man family. In 1983, they worked with Bally Midway to create Junior Pac-Man, another entry into the Pac-Man series. Like Miss Pac-Man, this game comes with a series of gameplay and graphical improvements. Also, this was not the end of the legal battles for General Computers and Pac-Man, because there's a weird coda to this story. Bally Midway contracted with Nutting Associates to build a baby Pac-Man game in October 1982. This game is a pinball video game hybrid, the first of its kind, that allowed players to play both pinball and an arcade game. General Computers had nothing to do with that game. Furthermore, the company wasn't seeing a profit on any of the various Miss Pac-Man merchandise or the merchandise of the growing Pac-Family. General Computers sued Bally Midway over the royalties, claiming that since they had come up with the idea of the Pac-Man family, they should get the royalties on any Pac-Man family products, including the hybrid pinball game that had a ton of reliability issues. Bally Midway, Namco, who is the Japanese owner of Pac-Man, and General Computers eventually settled. General Computers was entitled to royalties on the Pac-Man family products. Given the huge amount of merchandise, additional games, and sequels, that wound up going very well for General Computers. The legal issue would pop up again in 2000 when Namco of America released a combined Miss Pac-Man Galaga Class of 1981 machine. I actually remember playing this in college. Anyway, General Computers was not consulted and wound up entering into binding and confidential arbitration over the issue. For Pac-Man, the franchise was just getting started. Dozens of different games and ports would be released, extending the Pac-Man family further. You can certainly argue that Namco and Midway would have eventually extended the family on their own, and you'd probably be right, but it was General Computers who did the programming, came up with the design, and ultimately turned a profit. It's sort of wild that an outside company, not the creator of the game itself, is the one that extended the series and helped to really launch it into the stratosphere. The Pac-Man experience also taught video game developers a lesson that they would learn over and over again. Sequels and remasters work. Games like Pong, Breakout, and Speedway all had sequels or remakes at the time, but Miss Pac-Man was undoubtedly the most successful sequel that had been made by the 1980s. It set the stage for the growth of intellectual property within the video game industry. In that regard, General Computers actually helped put video games on the map and on par with other industries like television and movies. As for General Computer, their business took a different turn. They didn't immediately exit the video game business. In fact, they made other games like Food Fight and Quantum. From there, they designed hardware for the Atari 7800 and created more than 70 games for the system. In 1982, having made a massive profit thanks to Miss Pac-Man, they leased a building near MIT and recruited programmers from the college. According to McRae, General Computers was the biggest employer of MIT students that year, beating out the major players including IBM and Hewlett-Packard. General Computer did move in a different direction in 1984 when they began to make peripherals for Macintosh computers. I suppose this stays in line with their overall philosophy: make good things better. Her products included the hyperdrive, which was Mac's first internal hard drive, as well as a series of printers. They would eventually shift entirely to the production of laser printers before closing down in 2015. Just to say, this is a huge success story in the world of video games. Two kids with technical skills and know-how figured out how to make a good thing better, make more money, and take on some of the biggest names in video games. When challenged, they didn't fold. Instead, they developed a win-win that resulted in everyone involved, including them, making more money. In a world where entrepreneurs are all too frequently crushed, chewed up, and spit out, yes, I'm looking at you, Atari, this was a rare win. I'll take it. So, you made it here. That means that you must like what we have to offer. If that's the case, I hope you consider liking the video, clicking on whatever the almighty YouTube algorithm has served up for you, or hitting the subscribe button. Regardless, I hope you had a wonderful day out there, and I hope you liked watching this video as much as I liked making it. Take care, folks.